I just had this utter sensation of disbelief, and I was saying, they can't be gone, she can't be gone, she must be there. Kate was screaming hysterically that she'd checked and she was gone and someone had taken her. You're just thrown into this absolute nightmare. Terrifying ordeal. I think the worst thing that could happen to her.
It started like a scene no parent could ever prepare for. Kate McCann ran into the apartment, her voice cracking into uncontrollable screams. She shouted that Madeleine was gone, that she had checked, and the little girl was nowhere to be found. Panic spread instantly. Friends rushed out of the restaurant, their dinner forgotten, as disbelief set in. It was impossible to imagine. One moment, a family holiday in Portugal. The next, the horrifying realization that a child had vanished. The weight of that night fell like a storm. Kate's voice echoed in the corridors. Jerry's face tightened in disbelief, and their friends stood frozen, torn between shock and action. From the very first minutes, two versions of reality began to form. The story that went out to the world was one of abduction, a stranger slipping through the night to take a sleeping child. It was simple, terrifying, and fit the fear that grips every parent's heart. But behind the walls of apartment 5A, a different narrative began to take shape. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered glass. What if this was not a kidnapping at all? What if something far more tragic and intimate had happened, and what followed was not a desperate search, but a desperate cover-up? This is where the story of Madeleine McCann turns from tragedy into mystery. The lines between accident, negligence, and deliberate concealment blur until no one can say for certain what the truth really was. But the night of May 3rd, 2007, left behind more than grief. It left behind a trail of contradictions, silences, and details that would haunt the case forever. On the surface, the timeline of that night seemed straightforward. At around 9:80 p.m., one of their friends, Matt Oldfield, volunteered to check on the McCann children. He entered the apartment briefly but admitted later that he did not thoroughly inspect the room. He didn't see Madeleine in her bed, yet he also didn't sound an alarm. Instead, he returned to the restaurant and casually told the group that everything was fine. That choice, his decision not to act, would become one of the most debated elements in the case. Just minutes later, at 9:05 p.m., Jerry McCann himself walked into the apartment. According to his statement, everything appeared normal. Madeleine was in bed, her siblings were asleep, and nothing was out of place. He then returned to dinner, but this moment would later become a focal point, because from that time until 10 p.m., there are no independent witnesses to confirm what happened inside apartment 5A. At 10 p.m., Kate McCann went to check on the children. This was the moment when the alarm was raised, when she screamed into the night that her daughter was gone. The group scattered, shouting Madeleine's name through the streets, alerting neighbors and tourists. But by then, almost an entire hour had passed since Jerry's last check and Matt's incomplete observation. That 60-minute gap is a black hole in the timeline. No neighbor reported hearing anything unusual. No passerby saw Jerry during that time, and the apartment seemed to fall into an eerie silence. In a case where every minute matters, this unaccounted stretch of time became the heart of suspicion. Was Madeleine already gone? Had something happened inside that room while the world outside remained unaware? When investigators examined the apartment, the first thing that stood out was what they didn't find. There were no signs of a break-in. The shutters weren't forced, the locks weren't damaged, and the windows bore no scratches or fingerprints. Yet, Kate and Jerry insisted early on that Madeleine had been taken through the very window that showed no evidence of intrusion. This inconsistency planted one of the first seeds of doubt in the official story. Then came the detail about the back door. The patio door at the rear of the apartment opened directly into a small garden, which led to an unlit pathway surrounded by bushes and scrubland. At night, it was pitch black, invisible to passing eyes. For anyone wanting to move something or someone unnoticed, this was the perfect escape route. And on the night Madeleine disappeared, that door was left open. The doubts only deepened with the testimony of neighbor Pamela Fenn, who lived in the apartment directly above. She reported hearing Madeleine crying for more than an hour the night before she vanished. The sound was relentless, a child's distress that went unanswered. This detail hinted at a troubling pattern. Madeleine may have been used to waking during the night, looking for her parents. From here emerged one of the most haunting hypotheses. What if, on that final night, she woke again? Hearing her father's voice outside as he chatted with a friend on the street, she might have climbed onto the living room couch to peer out the window. In doing so, she could have lost her balance and fallen headfirst onto the hard-tiled floor. At 3 years old, her skull was still fragile. Experts noted that such a fall from even a small height could have caused fatal injury. Later, specialized dogs would alert to the scent of blood and decomposition near the couch. If this theory is true, then what unfolded was not the work of an intruder, but a tragic accident, followed by decisions made in fear rather than truth. To understand why suspicion grew so heavily around the McCanns, one must look at the dogs. Eddie and Keela were not ordinary animals. They were elite cadaver and blood detection dogs from the South Yorkshire Police, trained with near-perfect accuracy to find traces invisible to the human eye. When brought into apartment 5A, their reactions painted a chilling picture. Eddie, the cadaver dog, alerted in multiple locations, including the corner of the bedroom where Madeleine was supposed to have slept, and shockingly, on Kate McCann's clothing, specifically one of her jackets. Keela, trained to detect human blood, found traces under the ceramic tiles in the living room near the couch. These weren't simple stains. The blood had seeped beneath the tiles, into the grout, where it could not be wiped away. Forensic analysis revealed the sample contained a partial DNA profile, 15 out of 19 genetic markers matching Madeleine. While not legally conclusive, experts agreed it was statistically significant. More damning still, both dogs later alerted inside the trunk of the Renault Scenic, a car the McCanns rented 24 days after Madeleine's disappearance. Eddie signaled the scent of human decomposition, while Keela confirmed the presence of blood. This overlap, the same place, 2 different dogs, 2 different alerts, was almost impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Even the car key fob carried the scent. Scientists argued over contamination, but when the canine evidence, DNA traces, and the timeline are viewed together, the weight becomes undeniable. The dogs did not prove how Madeleine died, nor did they prove who was responsible, but they revealed something the abduction theory could never explain. Death had touched apartment 5A, Kate's clothing, and the McCann's rental car. It was evidence of silence, hidden in fibers, beneath tiles, and locked inside a trunk. 2 eyewitness accounts would become some of the most haunting and debated pieces of the Madeleine McCann puzzle. The first came from Jane Tanner, a friend dining with the McCanns that night. At about 9:15 p.m., she stepped outside the restaurant and noticed a man walking along the street near apartment 5A. He was carrying a young child in his arms, a little girl wearing a pale nightgown. Her head hung limp against his shoulder, lifeless and still. Jane, who knew the McCanns personally, later admitted that the sight filled her with unease, though she did not raise the alarm at the time. 45 minutes later, at around 10 p.m., another witness saw something eerily similar. Martin Smith, an Irish tourist on holiday with his family, encountered a man descending toward the beach, also carrying a small blonde-haired girl. The child had no shoes, her body appeared slack, and she did not move. At first, Smith thought little of it, but days later, after seeing news footage of Jerry McCann returning to the UK, holding one of his twins in a similar way, he felt a chilling recognition. He later stated that he was 80% certain the man he saw was Jerry himself. Both sightings described the same disturbing image, a barefoot blonde girl, limp in the arms of a man who matched Jerry's build. The paths these men walked led away from populated areas into darker, quieter routes, roads chosen not for safety, but for secrecy, and the times matched perfectly with the 1-hour gap in the McCann timeline. If Martin Smith was correct, then the official story of abduction collapses. Madeleine was not taken by a stranger. She was carried through the shadows by someone she knew, someone meant to protect her. And with that possibility, the case transformed from a mystery of disappearance to a question of concealment. Among the many unanswered questions in this case, one detail stands out not because of what was found, but because of what vanished. Before May 3rd, Jerry McCann was often seen carrying a large blue tennis bag around the Ocean Club resort. It was big enough to hold multiple rackets and towels, and witnesses recalled it as part of his daily routine. But after Madeleine disappeared, that bag was never seen again. When police inventoried the McCann's belongings, clothing, luggage, electronics, bedding, everything was accounted for except that bag. It was not in the apartment, not in the car, and not on any property lists. It simply disappeared. For many observers, this absence became more suspicious than any physical trace left behind. The theory is as disturbing as it is simple. In the chaos of that night, if Madeleine had died in the apartment, Jerry may have first hidden her body nearby. Later, perhaps in the early hours of May 4th, or in the following days, he could have returned with the tennis bag, placed her inside, and removed her without detection. The bag's size would have made it practical for transporting a small child, and its disappearance suggests it may have been deliberately destroyed or hidden to eliminate incriminating evidence. Forensic experts have pointed out that even if the bag had been scrubbed clean, trace DNA and bodily fluids could have remained in its fibers. That alone would have made it dangerous for anyone trying to conceal involvement. Destroying or discarding the bag would have been the only way to ensure it could never resurface. Its absence is not conclusive proof, but when placed alongside cadaver dog alerts, DNA evidence in the Renault Scenic, and the unexplained one-hour gap, the missing tennis bag becomes one of the darkest and most symbolic clues. Sometimes, it is not what investigators find that tells the story. It is what quietly disappears. 24 days after Madeleine vanished, the McCanns rented a silver Renault Scenic. By then, the world was watching. The case had become one of the most publicized disappearances of the century, and every move of the family was under scrutiny. But what investigators found in that car, or rather what the dogs revealed, ignited new waves of suspicion. Inside the trunk, cadaver dog Eddie alerted to the scent of human decomposition. Blood dog. Keela confirmed the presence of human blood. Forensic analysis later detected a sample that matched 15 out of 19 markers of Madeleine's DNA. Though not legally definitive, experts considered it highly significant. The car key fob 2 carried the cadaver scent. These weren't coincidences. They formed a pattern that pointed back to one conclusion. The car had been in contact with a deceased Madeleine. The troubling question was clear. If she died on May 3rd in the apartment, how could her DNA appear in a car rented weeks later? The answer most consistent with the evidence was that her body had been temporarily hidden, then moved later using the Scenic. Adding to the unease was a digital silence. On the night of May 3rd, Jerry McCann's phone records showed no activity from 9 WU to 11:30 p.m. No calls, no texts, no GPS pings. A man who was usually active on his phone had simply gone dark at the exact time Madeleine disappeared. And then there was Kate. In her police interview, she refused to answer 48 direct questions, simple, crucial ones like, "Did you check if the bedroom door was locked?" Or, "Why didn't you raise the alarm immediately?" Instead of cooperating fully, the couple quickly hired top-tier lawyers and PR advisors. To investigators, it looked less like grieving parents and more like a containment strategy. The Renault Scenic and the silence surrounding it became symbols of the case. The trunk whispered with DNA, the phone logs spoke with absence, and the unanswered questions echoed louder than any explanation. From the very beginning, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann was not treated like an ordinary missing child case. Within days, the McCanns had hired a professional PR team, media strategists, and legal advisors. Press conferences were polished, interviews carefully managed, and negative narratives swiftly countered with legal threats. To many investigators, it seemed less like a desperate search for a missing daughter, and more like a calculated effort to protect an image. The British press, with few exceptions, rallied to their side. Headlines framed the couple as tragic victims, while critics who questioned their story were often painted as conspiracy theorists or heartless cynics. Even the British government became unusually involved, offering diplomatic support and pressure that influenced how the Portuguese authorities handled the case. The narrative of abduction hardened quickly, and any alternative explanation was sidelined. Meanwhile, key evidence, the cadaver dog alerts, the missing tennis bag, the inconsistencies in timelines, was downplayed or dismissed. Witness testimonies that pointed to Jerry McCann carrying a child were minimized. The investigation, rather than following every lead, became entangled in media management and political influence. Over time, the silence grew heavier than the words spoken. It was not just the silence of unanswered questions, but the silence enforced by institutions, lawyers, and governments. The story told to the world was one of a kidnapped child. The story buried beneath it may have been one of an accident and a cover-up. But in the war between evidence and narrative, narrative prevailed. And so, year after year, the case became less about Madeleine and more about reputation, of a family, of a nation, of institutions unwilling to admit failure. Silence became not just a symptom of grief, but a strategy of survival. Nearly 2 decades have passed since the night Madeleine McCann disappeared, and still no body has been found, no definitive answers given, no closure achieved. What remains is not only a missing child, but a case defined by contradictions, missing evidence, and a silence that has grown heavier with time. The unanswered questions are as haunting as the evidence itself. Why did the cadaver dogs react inside the apartment, to Kate's clothing, and later in the trunk of the Renault Scenic? Why did a tennis bag, once seen daily in Jerry's hands, vanish without a trace? Why did Martin Smith, with 80% certainty, identify Jerry as the man carrying a limp child that night? And why did Kate refuse to answer 48 questions that cut to the very heart of what happened? The story of Madeleine McCann has become more than a mystery. It is a mirror reflecting how truth can be buried when image, influence, and fear collide. The Portuguese police admitted critical mistakes in the first 48 hours, failing to search the bushes behind the apartment, failing to secure the area. The British media shaped public opinion, while government pressure tilted the investigation's direction. Every missed opportunity deepened the shadow. And so, the silence endures. A silence that may have begun in panic, but was sustained by years of management, strategy, and protection. Silence from those who might know more. Silence from institutions unwilling to confront what the evidence suggests. Silence that has, in many ways, buried justice alongside Madeleine. The legacy of this case is not only a vanished girl, but a reminder of how fragile truth can be when it threatens reputation and power. Until someone chooses to break the silence, the truth remains locked away. Behind closed doors, beneath tiled floors, and within the echoes of an hour no one has ever explained.